So you can look at the lab directions for this one. All right, so for this week and next week, we're going to be looking at Lab 10, which is going to be covering Chapter 7, which is going to be dealing with arrays and the ArrayList class. In this particular case, we'll primarily be focusing on just regular arrays, specifically with a two-dimensional array. So if you take a look at the purpose here, the lab this week will focus on two-dimensional arrays. And I'm going to go ahead and clarify a couple of things from the announcement that I made on Monday. So I'm trying to make a few modifications to this particular lab assignment, just to make sure that this is not too difficult compared to what I was trying to do last semester. So I'm kind of making some adjustments in terms of precisely which concepts it's going to cover. So after kind of rethinking a little bit since Monday, I've kind of modified exactly which concepts you'll need to go through. In this particular case, you're still going to be dealing with two-dimensional arrays, but in addition to that, you're also going to be looking at array processing. So instead of making comparisons between two arrays, what you're really going to be doing is making comparisons between a single item that you're going to be trying to put into those arrays and then all of the values that are currently stored in that array. And then the other thing we're going to be looking at is being able to provide inputs to this program using command line arguments, since that's also something that's covered in Chapter 7. So those are going to be the primary concepts that we focus on. So you also want to make sure that you're paying attention to the videos related to that. So you're still going to look at the video for two-dimensional arrays, but in addition to that, you're also going to look at the array processing video. So making sure that you understand and really the array algorithms video, which is going to show you how to kind of do things like observing each one of the different items in an array. In this case, we're dealing specifically with making those comparisons, and then also making sure that you look at the video related to command line arguments. So in that playlist, the title of that video should be something to the effect of command line arguments and variable length arguments. So the main part that you're focusing on is going to be the command line arguments in that video. Okay, so that'll be everything for that. Getting into the actual task for this week's or this week and next week's lab, you'll go ahead and create a project called to-do list and then your first and last name, or you can just go ahead and name it Lab 10 and your first and last name. Make sure that you include comments summarizing the program. So this program will require reading data from and then writing data to a text file. So you want to make sure that you include the appropriate import statement in order to achieve that functionality. Really, that should be import statements, since you'll have two different things you need. One that's related to all of your file I/O, and then to be able to read from it, you also need the scanner class. Additionally, you want to make sure that the main method header indicates the possibility of throwing an I/O exception. So as we get into this, you're going to see that there are going to be some additional methods you'll include, and you're going to be calling those from the main method. And those additional methods that you have, that's where your file I/O is going to be occurring. So you're going to have the code for that. So you want to make sure that the main method is also capable of catching any of those exceptions by including that throws clause in your method header. So then in step 2, to kind of clarify what I'm talking about there, so this program is going to contain two additional methods besides the main method. These are going to be AddItem and CompleteItem. You're encouraged to include documentation comments for both of these methods, but since this is not focusing on methods anymore, that was primarily for Chapter 5, these documentation comments are not going to be required for this lab. And then both of these methods will also be capable of throwing an I/O exception, so you want to make sure that you include the throws clause in their method headers. And then some of the additional information about the method headers is going to be specified in a later step. So once we get there, then I'll kind of further elaborate on what's going to go into those two methods. For the next couple of steps, we're going to be taking a look at things that are primarily focusing on the main method, as well as in step 3 right here. We're going to go ahead and include a single variable declaration in the class level scope. So that's going to be outside of any of the methods. Essentially, it's at the very top of the program, still inside of the class for this program, but not inside of the main method. So within that scope, you're going to go ahead and declare a two-dimensional string array that will hold the items of your to-do list. This array will be both private and static. So in much the same way that your methods are public static, you want to make sure that this variable is private static. The array will consist of 10 items, and then each item will consist of 2 parts. So that's giving you both of the sizes for the two different dimensions of your 2D array. And then to further clarify those two parts that you're going to have, one of these parts is going to be the task to complete. So this is a to-do list. So each one of these different things is going to be a task. And then the other part is going to be the completion status. So basically, we're going to indicate either if the item or the task is complete or incomplete. And step 4, so in the main method, you'll go ahead and construct a scanner object that will be used to read from a file called todolist.txt. It's going to be a text file. In this case, because we're going to be dealing with reading from the file first before we start writing anything to it, that means that we can't really rely on the print writer to just make that file for us. So instead, you want to make sure that you've already created that file prior to running the program. In addition to the scanner object, you also go ahead and declare an int variable that will hold the number of items that is currently in the list, and then you'll go ahead and initialize this variable to 0. So essentially what we're going to do, as we'll see in the next step, is we're going to start this variable off at 0, and then as we kind of read off of that text file, we're going to be able to see how many items are currently in our list, and we're going to update this variable to indicate what that amount actually is. In step 5, so while we have some input to read from that file, we want to go ahead and store the contents of the file into our 2D array. So each item, meaning each of these 10 items that we have right here that consist of 2 parts, each item in the array is going to be read from the file in the following manner. So those 2 parts are going to be broken up between 2 different lines, where we're going to say that the first line holds the task to complete. We'll go ahead and store that into the first part of the current item of the array. The second line is going to hold that completion status. So we're going to store that into the second part of the current item of the array. And then the third line is going to be left blank. So essentially, you can imagine that each item is broken up into 3 lines where that third line is blank. And then you want to make sure that as you're stepping through the file, that you include an additional call to this next line method, the method that comes from the scanner class, to make sure that you step over that blank line or you just kind of skip over that. So in a second, whenever I actually do a demo of this, you'll be able to see exactly what all of the information inside of the file actually looks like to get a better sense of exactly what I'm talking about in step 5 here. Then we'll go ahead and use that int that holds the number of items to determine the position of the array where contents from the file need to be stored. So when we first do this, we're at position 0. Then we want to make sure that we're incrementing the number to step through each position that we'll need in the array. So starting at 0, after we've done this once, then we're going to go ahead and increment that. We'll move to the next position, which will be 1. We'll do all of this again for that next item. We'll increment it again, so it moves to 2, and then repeat this process until we've gotten all of the content from that file. And we'll know that we've hit the end of the file, or we've gotten all of it based on this condition for our while loop here. Okay. So then in step 6, so once we're done with that while loop, after we've stored the contents of the file into that 2D array, we'll go ahead and prepare some conditional code to check the command line argument at position 0. So this is the part now where we're going to be providing our inputs as additional arguments, additional command line arguments. So we want to make sure that we're actually getting each one of these different parts of it. In this particular case, our command line arguments are going to be broken up into 2 things. So we'll have one argument that's provided at position 0 of that list of arguments. That's going to indicate the action that we want to take. We'll see in a moment that there's 2 different actions, either add or complete. And then the other thing we're going to provide is going to be either the task that we're trying to add or the task that we're trying to complete. So going through these subparts, step 6 here, if this argument is add, we'll go ahead and call the AddItem method and then pass the command line argument at position 1, as well as the variable that holds the number of items in the list. Also, we want to make sure that this method does not return anything. Similarly, with our whoops, I have to adjust that here. This argument is complete. We want to go ahead and call the CompleteItem method. So we'll see that this is the correct one when we get to the later step down here. But we want to make sure that we call the CompleteItem method and then pass the command line argument at position 1, as well as the variable that holds the number of items in the list. And just like with our AddItem, this method also will not return anything. Okay. So you'll notice that when you're dealing with the method headers for both AddItem and CompleteItem, that other than the method name, these are pretty much identical. Okay. Getting into step 7. So now we're going to go through all the different parts for the AddItem method. So in the AddItem method, we'll go ahead and declare an int variable that will be used to keep track of your position in the 2D array. And we'll go ahead and initialize this variable to 0. For step 8, we're going to have another while loop that's inside of this method. So while the passed in task, which is going to be that command line argument that you pass in, while that task is not equal to the task to complete at the current position of the 2D array, and the variable is less than the number of items in the list, then we want to go ahead and just increment that variable. So as far as what you actually have to do inside of that while loop, this last little part that I have right here, that's everything that you're going to have to do inside of that while loop. So pretty much this entire explanation that I give right here is almost entirely just the condition for the while loop. Okay, in step 9, so after we've handled that while loop, then we have two different cases that we need to account for. One is going to be if the count is equal to the number of items in the list, then that's going to indicate that we have a unique item or a unique task that we want to add. So if that's the case, we're going to go ahead and add it to our list. So we'll go ahead and construct a print writer object that will be used to append new content to that text file. And then for this one, what we're going to go ahead and do is print the passed in task to the file. Then we're going to go ahead and print the word incomplete. It's going to be our completion status to the next line of the file. And then we're going to go ahead and print an empty line to the next line of the file. So that's where that blank line comes in that I mentioned back in step 3, I believe. Or in step 5 right here. Okay. So once we do that, you'll go ahead and close the file after performing these prints. And then you're going to go ahead and print the following message to the console, which indicates that the item has been added to the list. For the other case, if the count is not equal to the number of items in the list, that means that we stopped before we went through every item in the list, meaning that we've encountered some item that matches with the item that we're trying to add. So this indicates that the task matches a task already included in the list, and we don't want to have duplicates in it. I don't think that there's much of a point to doing that. So we'll go ahead and print the following message to the console, which says that the item already exists in the list. Okay. So that's going to cover everything for the AddItem method. So then for steps 10, 11, and 12, this is going to be for the CompleteItem method. So in the CompleteItem method, we'll go ahead and declare an int variable that will be used to keep track of our position in that 2D array and initialize it to 0. So you'll notice that steps 10 and 11 are going to be pretty much identical to steps 7 and 8. So for step 11 right here, again, we're going to go ahead and say that while the passed in task, that command line argument is not equal to the task to complete at the current position of our 2D array, and the variable is less than the number of items in the list, we'll go ahead and just increment that variable. So then where things are going to be different is going to be in step 12. So for this particular part, if the count is equal to the number of items in the list, then this is going to indicate that the task does not exist in the list. So what we want to go ahead and do is just print the following message to the console saying that the item is not in the list, meaning that whatever item we're trying to say that we want to complete, it doesn't exist, so there's not really anything to specify that we've completed. Instead, if the count is not equal to the number of items in the list, then this indicates that the task does exist in the list. So then using the int variable, we can go ahead and set the completion status of that item to be to completed in our 2D array. Then we can go ahead and construct a print writer object that will be used to overwrite content in the text file. So keep in mind a huge difference here. For this method, when we do our print writer, we're going to overwrite. Whereas in this one, when we're dealing with a print writer, we're using it to append. So keep in mind the difference between those two methods. So for this one, what we're going to go ahead and do is say for each item in our to-do list, we want to go ahead and print the task to a line of the file. We'll print the completion status to the next line of the file, and then we'll print that blank line to the next line of the file. And then we'll go ahead and print the following message to the console saying that the item status has been updated. Okay. So that's going to cover everything for the directions, going through the criteria for this lab. So your comments describing the program are going to be worth 5 points. The initial setup of the imports and the two-dimensional array is going to be worth 7 points. The main method is going to be worth 24 points. It's going to be 1 point for that throws clause in the method header, 2 points for the variable declarations, 13 points for the while loop, and then 8 points for the conditional code. The AddItem method is going to be worth 30 points. So it's going to be 1 point for the variable declaration, 9 points for the while loop, and 20 points for the conditional code. And then the CompleteItem method is going to be worth 34 points, with 1 point for the variable declaration, 9 points for the while loop, and 24 points for the conditional code. Okay. So that's going to cover everything for the directions for this lab. I'll switch over to Netbeans to do a quick demo of this, but before I do that, does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, so if there's no questions so far, we'll go ahead and switch over to Netbeans. So inside of Netbeans, I've got my to-do list program already put together. So take a look at projects first. So we've got our Java file right here. The other thing that I've got is going to be my text file, a to-do list. So I went ahead and made sure that that's already created inside of my files. If you want to be able to create this yourself and you're dealing with Netbeans, the way that you can go about doing that is just go ahead and select this folder, just right click on it and go to new. And then you want to go to other right here. And then from here, you're going to choose the other category. And if you choose empty file right there and click next, then what you can go ahead and do right here is just type in the name of it and then just make sure that you have that .txt extension on the end, and then it'll understand that you want a text file. Okay. So that'll cover that part. So then the other thing that we need to take a look at is the actual command line arguments. So I probably have something sitting in here right now since I was testing this a little bit earlier. But essentially what we want to do is go to run, we'll go to set project configuration and customize. And so that's going to go ahead and pull up this window right here. And from here, we want to go ahead and specify something inside of this arguments, this text field that we have. So the way that it's going to work is you're either going to put in either add or complete. So that's going to be your argument at position 0 when it's looking at that list of arguments you're providing to it. So we'll go ahead and start with the add. And then to make sure that our task, which is going to consist of, probably it's going to consist of more than one word, to make sure that it understands that that task is a single argument, we're going to go ahead and put this inside of double quotes. So this is a pretty useful thing that you can do here. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and say something like finish lab explanation, and then just close that off. So this means that add is going to be at position 0, and then this entire statement that I've included inside of these double quotes, that's going to be at position 1 for my arguments list. So I'll go ahead and push OK. And then when I try to run this program, oh, does it have the wrong one? I'm using the wrong thing. Let's do run file. Did it modify it when I was playing around with it earlier? Okay. This error might be because of the fact that I was trying to test something else with my actual command line. There we go. Okay, so yeah, so in my case, I just did clean it really quick. So we went ahead and ran that. So it says item added to the list. So I went ahead and took the argument that I gave it and it added that to this file. So now we can see right here, we've got our finish lab explanation. So that was the first line for that entire item. Then have our incomplete, so it printed that on the next line. And then we've got this blank line right here. And so I'll go ahead and pull this down a little bit now. So we can see we've got a blank line here. So we actually have an extra line, 3 and 4 both blank because of the way that it handled that. So then if I go ahead and add another item to this, so let's say we go back over to this, we'll go ahead and click customize. So let's say I go ahead and add another one. Let's say and lab meeting. So I'll save this for the end of this. Then push OK. So then if I go ahead and run this again, it will go ahead and update this again. And now it's going to go ahead and add the next one just underneath that. So in this case, because I'm using the AddItem method, it's just going to append that to this file. So you can again see that exact same approach. We've got our task on one line, we've got this incomplete on the next line, and then we've got that blank line just after that. So of course, the approach here is basically to just have the blank line as a way to kind of separate each one of the different items so they're not all kind of just lumped together. Makes it really hard to read after a while. So that'll cover all of that. And then the other thing we want to be able to do is the complete command. So we'll go ahead and come over here. But before I do that, let's try one of the things. Let's say that I've already got a particular item in the list and I try to add it again. So maybe I've got this add in lab meeting. So we'll leave that as it is for a second and try to run this once more. And so if we do that, then it's going to say item already exists in the list. And it's also not going to update anything inside of it. So it's just going to leave it exactly as it is. So that'll be the behavior when we already have the item in the list and we try to add it again. So let's say instead, we'll switch to complete. And let's say that for this one, first what I'll do is just demonstrate what happens if we try to complete a task that doesn't exist. So let's say I want to do something like complete finish lab demo. So if I go ahead and run that, it'll go ahead and say item is not in the list, and then nothing happens to the file. And then instead, if I go ahead and put in something that does exist, so I'm going to go ahead and say finish lab explanation. And we go ahead and run it like that. Then I'll go ahead and say item status updated, and we'll also see that now this incomplete changed to saying completed for this. Okay. So I think since I've already set the task to completed, this is a good place to stop. So based on the directions and the demo, does anybody have any additional questions, or really just any questions now about this next 2-week lab?
So we have to do those steps, like, to add the item to get this results here, or this is just to show us how it works?
So this demo is just to show how it works. When you try to run it yourself, you're going to also try to implement it with the command line arguments. So if you're primarily talking about this window,
Yeah.
Once you start to complete certain steps of your of this lab, you want to be able to test it in this exact same way. So you want to make sure that you navigate to this window and then set up your arguments. And I guess for anybody that's doing this with either Eclipse or IntelliJ or any other IDE like that, if you're trying to get through to this window, there should be something pretty similar, I would imagine, when you're looking at your project properties and looking for something like a run behavior or a run environment, and then there should be some kind of arguments list that you can specify. This lab is just going to be on stuff that's covered in chapter 7. So the main concepts that you want to be able to cover here, I think for that particular part, let's say I just go ahead and put it in right here. So the main concepts that you want to be looking for, the video titles won't be exactly what they are in the playlist, but essentially what you're looking for is going to be 2-dimensional arrays, array processing, or maybe algorithms, something kind of like that, and then command line arguments. So essentially you're going to be looking for the videos that cover these 3 concepts, since that's primarily what this lab is going to focus on. Any other questions? Okay, so there's no more questions about the lab. One other thing that I want to go ahead and clarify now, since this is going to be our next 2-week lab, that means that we don't have any new lab to go over next week. So next week is also going to be the next time that I will be setting aside for the semester project. So this time around, since you guys have already chosen your groups and your project ideas or your programming problems, next week is going to be used essentially as an opportunity for you guys to just continue to work on the project that you're doing. And as you're working on that, if you have any questions, then you'll be able to ask me immediately about whatever it is that you're working on. One of the things that I'll be able to do next week, a thing that I can go ahead and set up for anybody that wants it. If you're working in a group, I can actually set up breakout sessions. They're essentially just groups in Zoom that would allow you to essentially work with the other people in your team. So it kind of creates like a pretty easy to work with little environment for you to do anything in, and then also still be able to ask me questions whenever you need to. So that'll be the plan for next week. I don't know if anybody has any questions about what's going on for that. I don't know immediately if there's anybody that might not have told me about their group or idea yet, but possibly you want to do that soon, since technically you should have done that by Friday, last Friday. Yeah. Are there any questions about any of that?
So what we have left is the lab, the next 2 weeks lab, and the project and one assignment, correct?
At this point, you'll have this 2-week lab, the project, you'll have the assignment for chapter 6, and then you'll also have the bonus lab.
When is going to be the bonus lab posted?
The bonus lab will go up on the 21st. So basically the day that this lab is due, that same day will be when I talk about the bonus lab.
Okay.
Hey, hello. My name